Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R.CHURCH.
On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look back at 2,000 years of church history. Gary Stearman has written an article for our March edition of Prophecy in the News magazine that is entitled Prophecy, Lost and Found. It's a fascinating story of what happened to prophecy after the apostolic age, the end of the first century, the death of the last apostle, and Jesus had not returned. How did the church feel? Gary Stearman is here to discuss that with me on today's program.
And today we're going to ask a question, which I ask in this article. Why was prophetic teaching pretty much abandoned in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era? The answer to this question, J.R., is not only fundamental to our understanding of church history, it's fundamental to our understanding of prophecy itself. So stay with us because this is going to be an interesting program.
Now, you have written in your article, the first century prophetic plan of God simply disappeared. Israel was dispersed and thought lost forever. That's a fascinating view, because we know that the Apostle Paul taught his people the imminency of Christ's return. In fact, it was as if he's coming back before I die. You know, I have a lot of people tell me today, I'm convinced that I'll be alive for the rapture. Well, the Apostle Paul was convinced that he would be alive for the rapture.
Yes.
In fact, the people in Thessalonica, and the church at Thessalonica, that is, were really frustrated because some of them were dying. So the Apostle Paul writes to them and he says, I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep. That is, your loved ones who you thought would be alive to see the return of Christ, and they have now died and passed on. He said, I want you to understand this. This is from the word of the Lord himself. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, you know. And he said, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Gary, he believed sincerely that he was coming back before the end of the first century.
That's right. And to the Thessalonians, Paul wrote these words, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. He compliments these people of Thessalonica. For from you sounded out the word of the Lord, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith to Godward is spread abroad, so that we need not speak anything. These people were evangelistic. For they themselves show us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols, to serve the living and true God. And, this is key right here, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come. J.R., these people are living in the middle of the first century.
Yes.
And he tells them, your job is to evangelize. It is to wait for the Son from heaven prior to the coming wrath.
Isn't that amazing?
It is.
Now, you got to understand that this was the first New Testament book ever written. 1 Thessalonians was written before Matthew.
Yes.
Before Mark, before Luke, before the book of Acts. It was the first book written as early as perhaps AD 51. And already these people were saying, what about my cousin, my dad, my mom, my brother, my sister? They're dead. They died yesterday. What are we going to do? And the Apostle Paul says, here's the word from the Lord. He's coming. He's coming with a shout. Mm-hmm. He's going to raise the dead. So not to worry. And then, Gary, when he says that those people waited for his Son from heaven, and that when this comes, when Jesus comes to raise the dead, He's going to deliver us from the wrath to come. That's a pre-tribulation rapture there.
It is. And then, J.R., in 2 Thessalonians, he writes to the same group of people, and he says in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 5, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come." Now that day would be the day of Christ, the day of the Lord, the day of wrath. Meaning you'll be delivered out before that day. "That day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Now, J.R., the temple was still in full operation at this time.
Absolutely. That's very important to bring out here.
Yeah. Well, what this means is that the people receiving this letter could talk to each other in the next church meeting, and they would say, "Look at this letter Paul has written us. The temple over in Jerusalem, we know it's being occupied by people who are not necessarily the moral and ethical people that they should be." And it would be just a hop, skip, and a jump until one of those people stood up and declared himself to be God. It could happen any day.
Well, Gary, James was over there in that temple praying every day.
That's right.
On his knees, till his knees were so callous they called them like camel's knees. And so these people were convinced that the Antichrist was going to come in their day.
Yes.
And when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, don't you know, it crushed the Christians. It just destroyed their hope. How can the Antichrist come, and why hasn't Jesus come back? There had to be some doubt spring up there. John stayed around for another 30 years to assure them that Jesus was coming. And yet, you know, there's something happened to that early church after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that just sort of put a crimp in the style of the prophetic teachings.
And we must add something else. This was the era of Claudius and Nero and Vespasian and Titus and Domitian.
Yes.
And J.R., with increasing severity as the decades rolled by, the church was being pummeled day in and day out. They had to go into hiding. And they're talking to each other and saying, well, the epistles of Paul tell us we've got to wait for the Son from heaven. He could come any time.
Yeah, and He's supposed to save us from the wrath to come.
Yes.
You know, why are we going through the tribulation period? I mean, this is really, must have been what they were discussing. The Apostle John, in his first epistle, this is at least after AD 96, I think, he says, "These things have I written unto you concerning them that seduce you." In other words, there are people around with Antichrist seductions that were saying, where is the promise of His coming? For all things appear as they were from the beginning, you know. And Jude writes that in his epistle as well. So the frustration must have been there. And after John died, then things really sort of began to fall apart. Tell us, in your article, you've written about Clement of Rome. Tell us what he said.
Well, the fascinating thing is, and of course this is during the days of Domitian, who was a fiendish persecutor of the church. Clement of Rome died in AD 102. This means that he was a contemporary of the Apostle John. This is toward the end of the first century that he writes in 1 Clement 23 verses 2 through 5, which is a note of encouragement to the church at large. He says, "Wherefore let us not be double-minded, nor let our hearts form vain imaginations concerning His excellent and glorious gifts. Let not that scripture be applicable unto us, which saith, Wretched are the double-minded, even they that have doubt in their heart, and say, We have heard these things in the time of our fathers, and lo, we have grown old, and none of them hath happened unto us." Ooh, he's writing to a group of disgruntled, disappointed doubters who are saying, we've grown old and none of these prophecies have come true.
He is addressing a frustration.
Yes, he is.
A frustration that the early church had because the apostles were dying off And what they said wasn't coming to pass. He's coming, he's coming, he's coming. Look for him.